Elder abuse. Who does it? Who's likely to be a victim of it? And what can you do about it? If you haven't watched before, my name is Dr. Nicole. I'm a medical doctor, a geriatrician, so I'm a specialist in the care of older adults, and I've been one for about 20 years. My purpose here on The Wrinkle is to share information to help you to age well, if you're an older person, or if you're caring for someone who's older. It's information that you can use to help that older person to continue to age well. Today's topic is difficult. It's about elder abuse. World Elder Abuse Awareness Day was June 15th, 2020, and it prompted me to think a little bit more about elder abuse. It can be tough to recognize, even as somebody who works with older adults all the time. So in this video, we'll define what elder abuse is and the different types of it. What are the risk factors for elder abuse? How you might be able to detect it, and then what to do about it. Elder abuse was actually defined by the World Health Organization in 2011. It's a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring with any relationship where there's an expectation of trust, which causes harm or distress to an older person. So that sounds pretty straightforward, but it can be complicated and kind of nuanced, especially because a lot of times the person who is the abuser is a family member or a loved one of the person, the older person. So it can be complex. Elder abuse can be in many forms. It can be physical, emotional or psychological, financial, and it can also include neglect. So that would be not supplying some care that a person might need, or some supplies that they might need, like medical supplies, or medicine, or even food, water, shelter, supervision, things like that. Elder abuse can take place in a person's home, and it could also take place in the older person's home or the family member's home, or at an institution like a long-term care home or a nursing home. We're hearing some information about neglect and abuse that might have been going on in long-term care, especially during COVID, and it's extremely frightening and disturbing. A 2015 study of the prevalence of elder abuse found that about 10% of people over the age of 65 in North and South America were victims of elder abuse. That number went up to about 47% if somebody was living with dementia. There are risk factors for elder abuse. So if a person's over 80, if they have cognitive impairment, if they have more disability, that can increase the risk that a person will have elder abuse inflicted on them. Other things that can put a person at risk include things like a socioeconomic factor. So if somebody has less financial resources, that can really put a person at higher risk of financial abuse for sure, especially if the abuser is dependent on the older adult for money or shelter. There are factors about the family that can increase the risk of abuse. So if there are sort of family stressors going on, like somebody being very ill, or sometimes we see families where both of the elders in a marriage are have a lot of disability, and maybe both of them are living with dementia. So that can increase the risk of abuse. And so can factors about the care partner. So if an older adult is relying on somebody who maybe has a history of mental illness themselves, now that's not to say that people with mental illness can't be good caregivers and are more likely to be abusive, but it's a risk factor because someone who isn't well themselves might not be able to meet a person's care needs, and they might be more likely to end up being in a situation where there's some abuse or exploitation or neglect. Substance abuse is another thing that can increase the risk of abuse. So that could be substance abuse on the part of the older adult or on the part of the care partner. And that might be a sign. Sometimes when we see substance abuse, if we're doctors or nurses, geriatricians included, if you see someone who is abusing a certain substance, it's probably good to think about, is there any kind of an abuse situation that is promoting the older person to drink or to use a substance as a way of escaping? It can be hard to detect the physical signs of elder abuse. And that can be because older adults can sometimes have those signs for other reasons, and we don't want to jump to conclusions. It can be hard to detect signs of elder abuse because some of the things that we would be looking for, like fractures or bruising or cuts or tears, we might call them lacerations in the skin, somebody not getting their medications properly or having weight loss or malnutrition. Some of those things can be caused by other medical conditions or things that are going on with the person. So they could be signs of abuse, but they could also be related to other health issues. And we don't want to jump to conclusions, but that's why it's really important, and it usually takes an interprofessional team to kind of diligently look for those other causes and make sure that that's not the cause of the injury. It's really usually that we notice a pattern. So if we're noticing repeated issues without a very good explanation, that might make us think about elder abuse. Elder abuse is serious, so not only can it cause injuries that can be painful and can be debilitating, it can also increase the risk of death, and it actually does. So people who report abuse are more likely to die than people who don't, and that's especially true of older women. So if elder abuse is happening or neglect, it's important to know about it and to take steps to stop it. Just like with other kinds of abuse, it can be underreported. And that could be especially true when it comes to elder abuse, because there could be factors that are making the person at higher risk for abuse that are getting in the way of the person's ability to report that abuse. So, for example, if someone's living with dementia, it might be harder for the person to know the steps to take or to have clarity about what exactly is happening. And even if short-term memory is affected, a person might not remember who did the abuse or even that it happened, and might come up with another more benign explanation for the injury that was experienced. So it's really difficult. I know that some people have become very fearful, especially when it comes to abuse that might happen by a caregiver in the home, for example, like a paid caregiver or in long-term care or something like that. So a lot of people are using video cameras and other ways of checking in to make sure that the care that the older person is receiving isn't abusive and is appropriate. I can't necessarily argue with that. I think ideally that would be done with everybody's consent and knowledge. But if there are significant concerns about safety, I think it can be okay to do that kind of monitoring. It's really important to ensure the privacy of the older adult as well, though. So if an older adult is receiving intimate care, for example, that's not necessarily something that you want to monitor in a video type of way. So I think a best effort should be made to get consent, but it's really important to take some of those safeguards to protect someone. If you feel like you're being abused, you can always call the police. Elder abuse is almost always a crime, but it does depend a little bit on the jurisdiction that you live in. Some older adults are afraid to call the police because they're worried that if they're being abused by a family member, that family member might end up in jail. And it's very complicated. Even though abuse is taking place, it still might be the case that you don't want your son or your grandson or daughter to actually go to prison or have charges. And so oftentimes when somebody calls the police because they're worried about abuse, an elder abuse team might come on the scene. And so that's not necessarily the police, like in the TV show Cops, but usually there's a health professional as well. So I know locally my elder abuse team has a nurse and a police officer. And they usually work together to try to get the older person to safety, but also to resolve the situation so that it's not likely to happen again. So it doesn't always result in charges. But abuse isn't right. And so if seeking help means that there's negative consequences for the abuser, that can sometimes be the right thing, even though it's difficult. Thanks so much for watching. I think this is an important topic. I'll leave some links down below if you want to learn more. And if you want to know more about aging, you could watch the video that YouTube is suggesting for you right now, or go to our website at www.thewrinkle.ca.